Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. This will be the first in another series of videos that I want to make where I examine the zones of a given expansion and shout out my favorite among them. And this time around, I'm going to move chronologically from vanilla up through current content. I'm also going to cheat a bit here because there are 40 zones in vanilla, 41 if you go by the Cataclysm versions. So I'm going to go ahead and split it up into this video covering Kalimdor and another video that will cover Eastern Kingdoms. And then I will proceed to the Burning Crusade, doing one video per expansion. I did consider making this a series of ranking videos, but I honestly think I would find that too difficult. Zone design in WoW is just too good, even back in vanilla days. And I feel like there would be quite a few instances where I just don't know how to rank them. I mean, usually I can pick out a few favorites and a few least favorites, but the zones that fall in the middle are the ones I know I would really struggle with. And a lot of vanilla zones, I just don't have that much to say about. They were on average pretty small because flying wasn't a thing yet, and because there were so many of them, you didn't wind up staying in any of them for particularly long. Plus, it was vanilla. The zones tended to be pretty straightforward. So instead, I'm just going to talk about the zones in a way that feels natural to me and try to make sure I hit all of them. And I'm going to start out where I started out. My very first character was a Tauren Shaman, and the character still exists today, even though he has been race changed a number of times. So unsurprisingly, I have a deep love for the zone of Mulgore. It's just a nice, scenic, open plain, and we don't get that very often in WoW. It was picturesque, it was peaceful, and it epitomized what I loved about Tauren back in the day. And I'm going to continue on with what I consider the flat Horde zones. That is, most of the zones in southern Kalimdor that Horde players are likely to level through, and which incidentally tend to have fairly flat topography. And these tended to be my favorite zones in vanilla. I'm not entirely sure why. I suppose there's a simple and rustic appeal to all of them. Certainly the color palette is warmer than other areas of vanilla, and I'm sure nostalgia does play a huge part here. So before we move on to the Barrens, I'm going to zip over and talk about Durotar real quick. I do like Durotar overall, but among zones that fall into this camp, it's probably one of my less favorites. I do find it a bit funny that Thrall chose to settle in this land as a sort of penance for his people. Like, what the heck, Thrall? Just because your people had a sordid history, you're gonna punish their children by settling in a place devoid of natural resources? But as a player, I do enjoy the zone. I actually like that the Cataclysm added the South Fury watershed, but I would have preferred if Thunder Ridge had remained unflooded. Now, after their starting zones, Orcs, Trolls, and Tauren were all funneled into the Barrens, which was itself a massive zone by vanilla standards that covered a massive level range, leading to the infamous Barrens Chat of old. I think it may be the only representation of a savanna that we have in the game, and I think it did a pretty decent job of representing that. And I really cannot overstate how popular of a zone this was. Of course, in Cataclysm it was split in half, with the Northern Barrens being where you would go after your starting zone, and the Southern Barrens coming up later. I do think it made sense at the time to split the zone in half. It was far larger than most other vanilla zones, and the level range was quite considerable, but it's just not that big by modern standards. And as scaling technology has continued to improve, the large level band that was initially there has just ceased to be relevant. I'm also not a fan of the giant chasm that Deathwing put there. Me complaining about Cataclysm changes is going to be a recurring thing in this video, so get used to it. But enough about that, let's move on to the Stone Talon Mountains. And this was another zone that I absolutely loved, particularly the vanilla version. It was a very cozy feeling zone that gave you a lot of the Barrens color palette, but it started to close you in a bit with some more interesting terrain, and it gave you some greenery on top of that. It's still a pretty good zone after Cataclysm, even if I don't like it quite as much, but there also tends to be this sort of red filter on when you're in the zone. I'm not sure if it's always there or if it was just tied to the Horde quest line, but either way, I do not care for it. Next up in this region, if we're going by level brackets, was Thousand Needles. And yeah, this was just straight up my favorite zone from vanilla. I still remember riding south through the Barrens and past the Razorfen section and coming across the Great Lift, and it was just the coolest thing. I had seen these Tauren style elevators before in Thunder Bluff, obviously, but this time they were bringing you down into the coolest place I had seen yet. There was just a simultaneously serene and exciting feeling about being down in the bottom of the canyon and right in between all of the needles. I love Freewind Post. I love all of the quests that had you traveling up the needles that were occupied by the Grim Totem. It became such a fun little adventure of sorts as you snaked around the needles and crossed bridges and kept going and going and going until you were all the way up at the top. Two quests in particular that I have memories of were the Air Totem quest, which was a massive disappointment after the epic journey that was the Water Totem quest, and the Test of Faith quest that teleported you to the top of one of the needles and asked you to jump off. And that wasn't even the entirety of the zone. There was also the Shimmering Flats on the east end of it, which itself is also a really cool area. Salt flats are awesome. But that wasn't the part of the zone that I was most attached to. I think it would have been a great premise for a separate zone entirely, and I didn't depict it here because I just didn't want to clutter up my drawing too much. And as you might imagine, I absolutely abhor what they did to the zone in Cataclysm. I get the thought process. They had a zone that was essentially a big hole with a bunch of islands. Why not just fill it up with water? But they didn't do much with the concept anyways, and I'm never going to be an advocate for them ruining old zones. Next up we have Desolus, and I know a bunch of people hated this zone, but I liked it. I think I just had a strong affinity for zones that felt quiet and isolated. It definitely had a darker ambiance to it, and a few too many centaur for my taste, even though it makes perfect sense. Maradon is essentially their capital. But I don't know, I just liked being there. You could even cross paths with Rexar. And of course you had the centerpiece of the zone, the Kodo Graveyard, which is easily one of my favorite landmarks of Vanilla WoW. So yeah, I was a bit livid when Cataclysm rolled around and they added a lush green area right in the middle of the zone, including overtop the Kodo Graveyard. Like, I know lots of people didn't like how desolate the zone was, but that's the point. It's literally called Desolus. But let's keep things moving with Tanaris. This was a nice, warm-feeling desert zone with lots of open space. I enjoyed everything with Gadgetzan, the Steamweedle Port, the Caverns of Time, and even the Silithid hives as they weren't too abundant. I think this one was popular with most players, and I'm actually pretty neutral about the Cataclysm changes. It was mostly just some flooding in the northeast section. And lastly we have Silithus, which is kind of the ugly desert zone. But it is very visually distinct, so I have to give it credit for that. The zone just had a lot of Silithid hives, which is fine, it makes sense given its location. They just didn't help endear me to the zone. And honestly, the place just kind of makes you feel itchy, which makes sense. It looks really dry and there are bugs everywhere. So I don't hate the zone or anything, but it's definitely not one of my favorites. Also, even if very few people cared for Silithus, I'm not a fan of the zone being eradicated by Sargeras stabbing his sword into it. You could have just had him hit the ocean or something. Now, there are 3 other zones in southern Kalimdor that I skipped over. I'll circle back to Feralis later, but let's talk about Ungoro Crater for now. I think Ungoro is fine, but I feel like other players have a much stronger affinity for it than I did. It, along with Sholazar Basin and apparently the Veil of Eternal Blossoms, served as petri dishes for Keeper Freya, thus explaining why you have this verdant hole surrounded by otherwise very arid land. It's also just sort of meant to evoke a Land of the Lost feeling, but it just really wasn't doing it for me. I think the presence of raptors and other dinosaur-like creatures in many other areas of the game took away the novelty of them being here. And the presence of Feralis, another green zone very close on the map, took away the novelty of that. There's still fun to be had here, of course. I really enjoyed everything with Marshall's Refuge and Fireplume Ridge, but relatively speaking, it just wasn't my cup of tea. We also had Dustwallow Marsh, which was fine. I think in general, you're just gonna have a hard time pitching swampy zones to me. That doesn't mean I don't want them to be there for the sake of biodiversity, but they're just not my favorite. But it did have some things going for it. As a Horde player, I enjoyed the presence of Brackenwall Village and the Stonewall Ogres that Rexar recruited to the Horde back in the Frozen Throne. And of course there was Onyxia's Lair, as well as Alkaz Island, and of course Theramore Isle. Now, lore-wise, I don't really care that we mana bombed the place, but I don't really understand or condone Blizzard's obsession with removing interesting areas of the world. Now, let's start on the northern half of Kalimdor with what can basically be summed up as Night Elf forests. You wouldn't think that there are that many zones that fit this description, but there are. There's 7. And that's not even counting Mount Hyjal, which I am classifying as a Cataclysm zone. Let's start way up north with one of the better ones, Teldrassil. It's pretty enough and one of the better green zones in the game. I think all of the pink and purple elements complement the zone very well, and it just works very well as a Night Elf starting zone. And I think the overwhelming majority of players can agree that burning it down was stupid both from a narrative and gameplay perspective. Moving on down, you'll run into Darkshore, and I don't think I appreciated it as much as I should have back in the day. Though to be fair, I mained Horde, and this is an Alliance zone kind of tucked out of the way. But much like Desolace, it has a somber beauty to it. It's sort of a gray forest set on the coastline. I want to say that the vanilla version was the best version. Cataclysm definitely ruined it by having a giant tornado in the middle of the zone, and the BFA version definitely helped by getting rid of that, but it's still not as good as it originally was. And then we have Ashenvale, which I know is another fan favorite. But again, it just didn't land quite as high for me. Not many vanilla forest zones did. And to me, it just feels like a less interesting version of Teldrassil. It's pretty dang big, but because there are trees everywhere, you can't navigate it nearly as easily as the Barrens. That's not to say I don't appreciate it for what it did offer though. I have a lot of nostalgia coming here for my Water Totem quest. And again, the vanilla version was better. I don't know who thought it was a good idea to put a giant volcano in the middle of the zone with a giant fire elemental standing on top of it at all times. Moving up north, we have Felwood, and I have to give it props because it does have more character than a lot of other wooded zones in vanilla, by the sheer merit of it being infested with demons. It's an ugly zone, and that's not a bad thing, it should be an ugly zone, but I was already kind of tired of the Night Elf Forest thing, so you could take that and make it uglier. It's not a great selling point, but I appreciate it for what it is, and I like the Timbermaw Hold stuff, which connected us to both Winterspring and Moonglade. And Moonglade is just not a good zone. It's small, it's just more forest, but this time it surrounds a lake, and it's got some druid stuff, but not a lot else. Oh, but it does have this really unappealing aquamarine tint to everything, so that's another reason to not like it. And even though it's supposed to have this massive importance to druids, when Legion rolled around and they needed a class hall for druids, they decided not to use it. They were just like, nah. Nobody really likes Moonglade, let's just give them a new area in Val'sharah. But Omen does spawn here during the Lunar Festival, and Omen looks pretty cool. Give us an Omen, Mount Blizzard. Over on the east side of the continent, we have Ajara, and I think this zone was amazing. Easily one of the most beautiful vanilla zones that we had. This was due to its very autumnal color palette. I love autumn feeling zones, and the fact that there wasn't actually much going on here. It's just serene and quiet, and has a lovely namesake. I do like that Cataclysm added a northern route out of Orgrimmar into the zone, but I don't like anything else that they changed about it. I love me some goblin stuff, but I don't want it here. Take your rocket ways and your terraforming and go put it in Moonglade or something. That would only improve the zone, not ruin it. You can't prove I'm a hypocrite. Next up, we have Feralis. I told you we'd circle back to it, and I think it's fine. It's really green, probably too green. There's more Night Elf stuff, but there's just nothing here that I really gravitated towards. I do think it's a shame that the Isle of Dread was sunk in Cataclysm. I don't think anyone cared about it that much, but again, why get rid of it? And for our last Kalimdor zone, we have Winterspring. Again, a relatively popular zone that just didn't do a whole lot for me. I tend not to be a big fan of winter levels in video games generally. It could just be because I live in an area where we have winter for almost half the year. I'm not in a rush to see any more snow, and it just invokes feelings of coldness in me. It's fine as a zone, it's just not really for me. So my original plan had been to do a ranking video for all 40/41 vanilla zones. And while that didn't come to pass, I did start doing the groundwork for it and found that all of my top 5 zones were in Kalimdor, which is extra impressive because it has fewer zones than Eastern Kingdoms. So my biases are pretty clear. It obviously helps that I started on Kalimdor, and that is where the larger Horde presence is. But yeah, for those curious, my tentative top 5 was Desolace in 5th place, Stone Talon Mountains in 4th, Mulgore in 3rd, Ajara in 2nd, and of course, Thousand Needles at the top. Naturally, my drawing for this week is Thousand Needles. If you were watching the video, you probably saw that I attempted to do somewhat of a painting piece at first, and it just did not turn out very well. Outside of grade school, I have basically zero experience painting, traditionally or digitally. And even though it theoretically might have worked for Thousand Needles, I don't think it would have worked as well for future zones I plan on drawing. So I came to my senses and redid it the normal way. Thankfully, it didn't take too much extra time. I I was able to draw over a lot of what I already had. And yeah, I wouldn't say that my art style or quality conveys it in the best way, but I just really find Thousand Needles to be both a fun and beautiful zone. And that is that. I will catch you in 3 months for the Eastern Kingdoms video. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.